I'm gonna level with you all. I'm an outsider. My experience with science fiction never really touched base with the subculture of cyberpunk. I haven't played the TTRPG. I watched Blade Runner, Paprika, Metropolis, Minority Report, The Matrix. It's not a genre I'm entirely unfamiliar with. Hell, my favorite Final Fantasy title at least borrows a lot of its aesthetics and style from cyberpunk sensibilities. But I am an outsider to this game in a myriad of ways. I've never played a game from CD Projekt Red before this one. I don't even really like Western RPGs that much. This is, in part, an experimental video for me. I usually write about something I'm very passionate about at the get-go, something that I know I'm going to have strong feelings for, whichever way they lead. And now I'm here, down the rabbit hole of a game I have almost no connection to, aside from watching Tim Rogers of Action Button's excellent videos on this game multiple times. And this isn't just idle curiosity or an effort to lift my style and substance from a YouTuber I admire. I find it a bizarre thing. Look, my relationship with this game, ultimately, I would believe, is the layman's. I heard the new game was coming out, what with all the pretty graphics. It wasn't long before I was scrolling Twitter, seeing other such lays man angrily griping about titling a game after a genre. My people, the ones that don't know about the tabletop game. From there, Cyberpunk 2077 became the game that fetishized a trans woman's body. Scandal. And that's not all. It's not long after that, in the slurry of memory, that bigger, much more grim conversations of crunch culture happened. Oh no. Labor exploitation. By this point, the game had long since fallen out of my already only nominal interest, and by the time the circus that had been built up over its graphical mishaps, its massive delays, all of that had been long abandoned. Out of sight and out of mind. And then about a year ago, a dear friend of mine came in hot out of nowhere to tell me about it, how good it is, how notably misunderstood it was, and by now it had been patched and patched and patched, balances, graphical fixes, optimization. It was, by all accounts, a different, smoother, better experience, but none of that really mattered, did it? Cyberpunk has gone the way of Red Dead Redemption 2, an occasional whisper of familiar talking points, but ultimately abandoned as a piece of our topical conversations. Culture trash. And that begs the question, doesn't it? By the time people started to sift through this new game that was condemned to subreddits and niche discords and a micro following of Tumblr blog posts, it had already eclipsed itself with Cyberpunk Edge Runners, which was advertised to me by word of mouth, specifically the words, "It's Cyberpunk, but if it was actually good." So, in response, seemingly as an exercise of my limited capacity to consume as much cyberpunk material as possible, I of course went ahead and watched all of it. It's pretty good. It's okay to like cyberpunk edge runners, but this project, this massive undertaking of a video game lingers in my brain as a puzzle, a bizarre curiosity. A few months ago, I wrote about a similar phenomenon with Pokemon games and how they survive in the modern attention economy, but this feels somehow more dire, more tragic. Around 500 people worked on this game, made it, delayed it, patched it, deplatformed it, re-platformed it so well that I am now showing you footage of my playthrough on my PlayStation 5 using the copy of Cyberpunk 2077 for the PlayStation 4, the very same version that was once obliterated. It shared the same fate our hero V does on some level. If there's poetry to be had in that, please recognize it now. There's never really been an experience in my life much like that of Cyberpunk 2077. This isn't me lauding the game for its groundbreaking novelty. It's firmly nestled in a genre of prestige, open world, meticulously crafted AAA titles. It has skill trees, modular gear upgrades, an embarrassment of riches amount of side quests, NPCs, waypoints, and whatnot. It's like most AAA titles I can think of off the cuff, but it puts me in an odd situation where I feel like I'm approximating points of references through titles that have vanishingly little to do with its vibe. It has a vast open world with a myriad side quests, just like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Pokemon Violet. It has a lot of guns that have special little quirks to them, just like Mass Effect 3. And this wouldn't be a problem so much if not for the obsession the game itself has with culture. See, before stepping into this project for reasons that I can hardly remember anymore, I felt a clawing, cavernous compulsion to engage with as much related material to this game before someone in the comments calls me a poser. I knew going into it that, contrary to Tim Rogers, I do not get to make these videos my full-time job, so I'm mostly cobbling together my thoughts from most likely one playthrough already putting me on the back foot. I got one very grim, sad ending that I felt was not unsatisfying, so much as not what I was going for. Then I looked it up and found that I could get at least another ending just by reloading my save and doing a different quest. The game is good. If you're here watching this in 2024 to make up your mind on whether or not, now that the dust has settled on its various controversies, it's worth a dive, I'd recommend it. If you like this kind of game. Even though it isn't really my usual speed, I, too, admit that I had a good time. The game functions. That feels like an insult. I'm not talking about if it performs well or not, which it mostly did, minus a couple of odd bugs, but the feeling I got has been off. This entire time, this game has struck a weird chord with me, and that's where I likely began to trawl through, picking at it, looking at the little seams in this game, and wondering why. Why does this game look and feel and play like this? Liquids and glasses look weird in this game. When a character sets a glass down on a table, it snaps like a little bit into position. These are the kind of minor league graphical scenes that I could not give less of a shit about in most other games I love with all my heart, but all of a sudden, this one game comes in with its triple-digit staff and nonopple-digit budget and a flat refusal to even start up properly on my roughly $2,000 computer, and it's turned me into a bizarrely shallow monster, obsessing over these things, in part because Cyberpunk kind of demands that I reckon with it in these terms. When I look at any given shot in the main story of this game, I see a lot of visual splendor on display. The game is shamelessly pretty, but it carries that with it into basically everything. In a way, it's bizarrely difficult to not lapse into talking about the game by proxy. It was the epicenter of many things. It poses many questions about the industry itself. It stands as weirdly representative of the modern video game and the desire to address the game on these terms. Its role as a piece of culture, a piece of history, indicative of things beyond it. Is it a grim specter resting over several highly controversial issues, from crunch culture to the depiction of trans bodies in advertising? Can it be the future of graphics and video games? Can it be a true honoring of the promises written in William Gibson's Neuromancer? Is it an open-world Blade Runner game? This game carried, during the height of its time in the spotlight, a collage of expectations and demands and impositions. Just in the effort of getting ready to talk about this game, I rewatched all 10 hours of Tim Rogers' review and Edge Runners, and I read Neuromancer, and all that time I knew that I was selling myself short. And yet, I want to ask why. This is, I think, the ultimate complication in talking about this game. The context surrounding all games are important, things that are worth considering, but I struggle to think of many titles other than this one that demands upon its context like this. And I think that on some level, in some circumstances, this obsession does way more to deflect from what is there in favor of criticizing what isn't, what should be, or in one particular situation, overblowing something that ended up being ultimately trivial. Let me be more clear. The game would be so much more interesting for me to talk about if they did anything more interesting with the advertising of trans bodies than one background poster that momentarily blew up on Twitter. So, instead of complaining about it, its graphics, its gameplay, its advertising, I want to examine the story more directly. And that's an ambitious task, not just because every story beat is, on some level, quietly and constantly put up to the Goliath living in the wake of this game, a constant question of, is this what they wanted to do with a game this ambitious? Triple digits of workers crunched nearly to death and non-upple digits worth of dollars to make this? Was this worth it? But it is also hard to do this because the game is way more expansive than I have time to properly reckon with. But if I'm to pre-sum up my thoughts on its story, it's this. This is the first game of this kind that has genuinely made me want to go back and play more of it. At the heart of any given story path through this game rests a deeply psychological conflict. Our main character, V, which delighted me to no end as that's among my real-life nicknames, is some shade of citizen of Night City, and in their efforts to become a legend on the streets, died with some bizarre artifact plugged into their brain, which revives them, but in the process entangles their personality and psyche with that of the 50 years dead terrorist Johnny Silverhand, played by Keanu Reeves. As a small aside, maybe this is just me being hypervigilant and weird about QR codes, but the rate and ease of which V and basically everyone in NC just slots random shards into their brain sockets genuinely distressed me multiple times in my playthroughs. You don't know where that's been, V. My initial go through the early parts of the game felt kind of blank. Sure, a lot of that was because I was constantly comparing my experiences with the game to the specter of it that lived in cultural expectation, but the process was fluid in a way I found odd. The game was gorgeous. The gameplay, while not something I'm super into usually, was pretty fun, though I kind of didn't quite get everything right away and ended up being kind of a gun-toting maniac before I really got into the meticulous hacking and frying a bunch of enemies by proxy like I get up to later in the game. The driving feels okay, but I've never been into driving much. It's all kind of a mess of weird things, none of which are usually my thing, all of which were smooth enough to be pleasantly unobtrusive. See, I come with some further baggage. The last big, sprawling, open-concept Western RPG I got into was Fallout New Vegas, and I have to say, if you want to deliberately have kind of a bad time with a game that many people consider to be one of the greatest to have ever done it, try doing a blind stream of it. It sucked, but beyond my chat being obsessive weirdos, that game struck me as a little rough to swallow. There was this constant sense of hyper-individualism that stuck out at me. I'd come to a new locale, a new conflict, and the way that conflict went down was almost entirely at my discretion. Everything felt bizarrely composed around the idea that I was the sole moving force in this world. I've come to understand that this is how it is in a lot of Western RPGs, and that on reflection, that is also just how it was in Mass Effect and Dragon Age. It struck me as a unique amount of discretion in the case of Fallout, I suppose, because the game is shockingly lonely. Even when I got my first companion, he wasn't exactly super chatty, and that kind of isolation and loneliness carried over into Cyberpunk. Now, okay, I know how this sounds. Please do not write about this in the comments. I will play New Vegas in my own time and have my own thoughts about it. Just remember that the game has a lot stacked against it because of the context I had going through it, but I do think I had an easier time swallowing the experience in Cyberpunk, that feeling of being alone. One of the peak strengths of this game, besides Keanu Reeves genuinely crushing it as Johnny, is the way the world has been composed to retain a perfect amount of grit and general distrust in you. There's this exchange I had with Rogue, calling her for work, that got at the vibe the game composed for you.
You had one job with Dex and fucked it up spectacularly.
You know that's not true.
Who cares? This isn't about skill, V. Only thing that matters is reputation. Why do you think you work alone?
The world isn't really built to have you work with a crew. You're a solo act, a kind of perpetual outsider to other tighter-knit communities in Night City. A reality that hit particularly hard after I got that bitter, sad ending and realized how much V must be feeling alone and discarded by people. I apparently, through my own ace spectrum wiles, did not flirt with Judy enough, hot off the heels of discovering Evelyn's comatose body, to pursue a relationship with her. Panam is inexplicably not a lesbian, and I met neither of the two male romance options until I went back for a second ending, and even then, Carrie's not into the corporate doll I made V into, since for some reason I wasn't just allowed to make them into a cat. The game can excel at chewing you up and spitting you out. V's closest bond from my initial playthrough was with Takemura, and I just took Johnny at his word that Takemura was dead in the attack. He's gone. Panam and Judy haven't called me. Rogue's planning a call in the future. The Voodoo Boys hate me, and I them for trying to kill me off during a mission for them. All that was left for my V was the cold, grimy deal in Hanako's hands, and a vague offer to follow up with Rogue over something. And in a moment of desperation, metatextual and textual, I went ahead. I met with Hanako. I decided that all of this, everything, had been to remove Johnny from V's head, and that she was going to do this. And it got her nothing. An empty, hollowed-out life in space, treated like a subject, cold professionalism, until the offer to just once again sell more of your soul to Arasaka. More and more they demand. I was, shockingly to myself, in tears as I had V toss that contract aside and tell Hellman that she wants to have her last 6 months back home, back on Earth, to a credit sequence of vaguely hopeful but mostly worried messages of those who remained in her life. I think that any game that can take me from non-committal and disaffected, playing through a game in a world, a context, a setting that I'm ultimately unattached to, all the way to someone desperate to make amends to my character, to reckon with Johnny's parting words and go back and follow up with Rogue and Panam, to call Judy and work for V's final run. I think that proves that there is genuinely something to Cyberpunk 2077. I avoided, maybe on principle, all the fixer side content. I'm not interested in celebrity cameos. I'm not interested in Grimes. I know that one of the romanceable guys is hiding in there, sure, but he's also a cop, and this time around V's done with being a sellout. When I think back on my experiences in the genre, Blade Runner, Edge Runners, Neuromancer, I think a lot of my concerns going in, some of which were very much confirmed in the opening act, was that the game was going to be obsessed with itself, kind of in the same way that all the fiction in the genre I've seen is. In sharp contrast to something like Final Fantasy XIII, which is an aesthetically similar game in a broad sense, but one that only invests a bare minimum of its game dialogue trying to catch the player up on anything, opting instead to keep the cast in their journey through their own sci-fi dystopia front and center. Cyberpunk 2077 lives and breathes with NPCs more than ready to explain technology that is bare minimum 50 years old to V, who has been in Night City all of their life in most cases, I'm pretty sure. There is a fascination with their speculative technology that's kind of everywhere in what I've seen. And I found it obtrusive at first, unnecessary navel gazing, but the story does move past that, opting to indulge in the more important things. The one element, the defining core at the heart of a lot of the genre, at least in my summation, is still here, and it is shockingly refreshing. Cyberpunk 2077 invests a lot in thinking about and looking at the nature of people, the fragility of our psyche, ourselves, and the desire to keep ourselves alive, keep that spark going for just a little bit longer in the grand scheme of our cosmic history. There are many story beats that are punctuated with an encounter with your personal brain Keanu Reeves to wax philosophical on the nature of what exactly is happening to you both. And for someone who has perilously low expectations for important AAA games talking about important AAA ideas, V and Johnny have a shockingly frank rapport on the nature of the self. A particular exchange between them sticks out to me, where V asks if the process is going to be painful, but also if it will be recognizable. Will V feel themselves vanishing, getting replaced with Johnny? Or will the transition feel so normal, so natural to their conscience, that they won't know why they were afraid in the first place? Instead of shooting for the grandiose, instead of trying to make this into a game obsessed with showing off its interesting philosophical argument, they made the right call and took it shockingly personal and intimate instead. It's reflecting on these, the best bits of this game, that help to gently smooth over the smaller stuff. This is where I likely benefit the most from the laborious updates and patches over the years since its release. The game's balance feels tighter, the bugs and glitches fewer, though not zero. The stuff that initially repelled a lot of critics were mostly gone. The game runs pretty smooth as a PS4 title on my PS5. I feel I further benefited from not obsessing over it and combing through the entire game's side content, leaving myself to invest in the main story and as much of Panem and Judy I could get my hands on, which are likely its best bits. The two quest chains I ended up doing just to fill time in between main story beats, the ones for the cops and for Delamain, felt more par for the course, idle time wasters that would occasionally reward me with a novelty or a fun car or something. Does this mean I recommend Cyberpunk, but also that you not spend a lot of time trawling through every crevice? No. Firstly, this isn't a review channel. I don't rate games and tell you whether or not you should play them. Secondly, I think there is meaningful fun to be had in soaking in this place. A lot of the initial frustrations I had with this game, while not going away fully, felt properly muted as I learned to filter out a lot of the maximalist noise overall the game. Every spot of it felt like it was aching for a photo op. Every NPC mugging for the camera that is your eyes. Everything dripping with flavor and detail waiting to yap endlessly at you over it. And in a manner probably much like V, part of engaging with this game is to become task-oriented, to push through the noise, to focus on doing your job and doing it right. And if it were just this, if it were just a compelling story wrapped up in a fancy package with Keanu Reeves and a shockingly brutal ending for the player in a rush to wrap things up, I really wouldn't make this video at all. I'd have had a good time and talked to my friends about the game that I know liked it. And I certainly wouldn't have spent all video gently emulating Tim Rogers, but I cannot just enjoy the game for what it is. Tim Rogers couldn't do it in 2021, and I suspect no one can. Maybe ever. There really is no art that is devoid of its context. No matter how postmodern, no matter how much a minimalist tries to produce something that simply is what it is, art has a nasty habit of entangling itself in the lives of its creators. Cyberpunk 2077 did not and never had any intention of being minimalist. This game lives and breathes its roots. It was marketed extensively and obsessively. It hired one of the defining actors of a generation of science fiction, and it did so with bombastic flourish. This game is as obsessed with its culture, its context, as I am. Every bit of praise I had going through this game would inevitably, sickeningly, and seemingly against my own will slide through the filter of asking if this was all worth it. Nearly $500 million and half a thousand workers all worked to make a game that I found, what, shockingly good if you sidestep the stuff in it that's kind of a drag? And that's kind of a mire of an observation, isn't it? It's an enticing talking point for this game because of its context. Cyberpunk isn't really that much of a departure on the development front from a lot of other games. Hell, Final Fantasy VII Remake has credited over twice as many people working on it, and I don't think I mentioned the size of its dev team once. But beyond this kind of obvious dead end, another thought struck me, far more existentially compelling than just the sheer scale of its production. This is what it looks like on Google Trends. It's kind of over, isn't it? This game is only a few years old, but it's also distinctly not in the conversation anymore. Yes, obviously, it still has fans. It has a niche community around it. I'm even loosely one of them. I'm going to have a friend help me set it up on PC with the furry mod installed, because of course I am, but it isn't really talked about anymore. And pulling further on that thread, one can argue that's kind of all art. Everything is ephemeral, of its time, here talked about, dissected, friendships forged and broken in the discourse mines, and then buried when the next thing comes around. Pokemon Legends Arceus has a benefit that I was blind to when I made that video, a benefit of being part of a legacy series. It will always loosely exist when people gather to bicker about Pokemon. Cyberpunk 2077's biggest cultural sticking points are what? It was a game made through labor exploitation? Keanu Reeves is in it? It had a nonsense controversy over trans bodies, and it's a little silly that the game's titled after a genre. Its legacy as a game inspired from the TTRPG of the same name is a fun fact, a bite-sized anecdote. I've come to the end of this video scattered, lost, much like V, honestly. I have a shocking amount of affection for this game, built and made to be a seamless piece of iconic culture, a benchmark for technical prowess, able to stand tall and brag about having a legendary film star in it, reduced to a punchline about crunch and glitches and bugs, and yet, I don't know. I tried to roleplay as V in this game. That may not sound monumental, but in every game of this sort where I'm embodying some kind of self-insert, I've always just sort of played vaguely how I would. Usually pretty selfless, pretty noble, but I had a character in mind for her. She was quick to trust people, but vengeful. She was happy to lend a hand, but not afraid to go guns blazing when things turned bad. I even tried to mimic my general opposition to eye contact with the camera, much to the detriment of my footage. This game, this kind of amalgam of culture trash, now abandoned in favor of a version of itself that is good, but didn't strike me nearly as hard, only for it to fall to the wayside as well. It's all kind of tragic. Maybe there should be a more profound lesson to be had here. Maybe it's important to make your peace with art as transient, something that comes into your life, changes you, and vanishes. I've never been good at that. I must instead believe that there's something worth holding on to, something meaningful in what has come and gone, and what we can remember and love about them, even now, even in the future. Thank you for watching. I'd like to give a very special thanks to Alexi Angelica, Athena Stripes, Bees Louise, Blair Renix, Blueberries in My Coffee, Colleen T, Evan Kearns, Foxy Hex, Gail Simmons, Grizz, Lewis Wells, Low Res, Maria Aladren, Michael McNay, Mocha Lapin, Narai the Redmarked, Noun Verbally, Professor Bopper, Saint Rawberry, Thomas Volpez, Tradegood, Valerian Wraithwall, and Zetetic. Thank you all so much.